in the latter half of the 90s, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon finally came to an end. And not only that, but also no further movies were to be made after the utter failure that was the third film. However, what followed is not what anybody expected. Instead, the concepts that could have been used for a fourth movie were taken and adapted for use in a live-action TV show made by the people famous for Power Rangers, Saban. The thing is though, the show was a disaster. Not only is it generally hated by TMNT fans, but it's also the only show not to get more than one season. But why? Why is it hated so much? What could have possibly gone so wrong? Well, the answer to that question comes pretty quickly. Let's take a look at the first episode, shall we? In fact, no, let's just start with the opening credits.
We're fantastic, never panic. Ninja Turtles.
I promise you that's the actual theme music. And it doesn't stop there either, it's used throughout the show as well, just in an instrumental form. And it might seem picky that I'm focusing on the theme tune first, but the thing is, it's actually quite indicative of what's to come. You see, first impressions are important, and that's where the show really falls at the first hurdle. Right from episode 1 we see that the acting is bad, the theme music wouldn't even be acceptable at Eurovision, and then there's the first time we see the Turtles. We see Raph, who's riding a motorbike, which is an issue in itself that I'll come back to. And clearly they've had to use a different type of head while he's riding. As a result, it doesn't have the same level of gubbins inside, and that means that his mouth is unable to move. Now, okay, that's fine, I suppose it's probably for safety reasons while on the bike. All you need to do is shoot him from a distance and don't give him any lines to deliver when his mouth can't move.
So, you want to play?
When he does get off the bike, the suit's actually not that bad, and the animatronics might actually be okay from a distance or with camera movement to mask them a little. So all you need to do is make sure that you don't do a locked off extreme close-up so that it's not so obvious that they're not able to match the mouth movements up. Which, of course, that's one of the first things that they do.
Any of you chumps put a scratch on my bike, you're footing the bill.
But the thing is, I do actually think the suits are perfectly passable, especially considering that this is a TV show, not a Hollywood movie. But almost immediately, you start to see some of the other issues which come from having to do a live-action show rather than the freedom of being able to animate anything you want, you know, like in a cartoon. For example, the Turtles no longer have a fully kitted out turtle van or turtle blimp. Instead, they now have a pretty stock Hummer, one that's just been painted green with some flame effects that shoot out of the back. But the problem is, because this is just a car, and probably also because it's a Hummer that weighs a few tons, in order to get any motion shots, rather than having it on a low bed trailer and shooting through the windscreen like you would normally do, they have the Turtles actually drive the thing in real life. Unfortunately, it would be impossible to do so in those suits because they wouldn't be able to see anything, so they just have a guy in a half turtle head hat on in the driving seat. Now you might say, okay, well, at least it was only for a brief moment. But no, you'd be very wrong, because they decided to use that brief moment in the opening credit sequence for the entire season. What's worse, they even lighten the shot so it's even more obvious. But this isn't the only time they have to find ways around the difficulties of the suits. When they're in fight scenes, the stunt actors clearly weren't able to see much, so they just put larger holes in their faces. And the fact that we can see that is actually pretty stupid, because for the rest of the scene they show that they're able to just shoot around it with quick motion and having the camera positioned behind the turtles rather than focusing on their faces. And when they do that, it actually looks quite good, but it's like they had two different directors of photography, one of whom knew what they were doing, the other just couldn't be bothered. Now, the holes in their face are visible throughout the show, especially with Venus, who we'll talk about in a minute, but they're particularly noticeable in the fight sequences. And for some reason, some of the Foot Clan look similar to how they did in the movies, which is perfectly fine. In fact, that's actually quite good. But then some of them are given gaudy, shiny outfits that wouldn't even pass at a kid's costume party. What was the point? Is it just cheap padding? Again, it's like they had two costume designers, one of whom just couldn't be bothered. Not to mention, the Turtles' headquarters look to be in better condition than most young people's apartments. I mean, seriously, this is New York City. This looks like some sort of loft where you'd have to pay thousands of dollars a month to rent. And it's meant to be the sewers. And the sewers of a major city, no less. But it feels like this has been written and designed by someone that doesn't actually know anything about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is weird considering Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were involved in this. It's like the producers just watched the third movie and took that as inspiration. At the time that this was being made, there was so much reference material, but it just seems like all of that was thrown out in favour of making something unique. So the point is, right from episode 1, things just weren't right. And from there, it only gets worse. The show itself just feels really poorly put together. Splinter and Shredder look fine, I guess, but the acting is just so bad. The attempts at generic Asian accents are painful, and I genuinely don't know what they're saying half the time. For example, we're introduced to a character called Chung-Yi. Now, this is a Chinese actor, but they dub him over with a white Canadian actor doing a Chinese accent. Not only that, I'm not trying to be funny here. I watched his introduction at least 10 times and eventually had to put on subtitles just to clarify that he's not actually saying that he's a master of the internal arse.
Dragons! I am Chung-Yi, master of the internal arts. Dragons! I am Chung-Yi, master of the internal arts.
But anyway, Freudian slips aside, the big thing for this season is that there's actually 5 turtles, not 4. This is Mei Pie-Chi, I think. But don't worry too much about pronunciations, you can forget that name ever existed because you only ever hear it in this episode. Soon after, they start calling her Venus de Milo, which I suppose is meant to fit in line with the others, except they're all named after Renaissance painters, and Venus de Milo is an ancient Greek statue by Alexandros of Antioch. So they've introduced a character to cash in on presenting a strong female, but not only have they decided to not name her after a female Renaissance artist, they decide to name her after something that is just known predominantly for her looks. Now, the story goes that Venus was apparently also with the other turtles in the sewers when they were exposed to the mutagen. But rather than being found by Splinter, she was found by Chung-Yi in Chinatown. Obviously, because if this is New York, then a Chinese guy must have been in Chinatown. And then after he rescued her, he took her back to China to teach her the way of shinobi, or ninja, which isn't Chinese. I mean, the way this show represents Asia is, well, it's kind of racist. Unlike the comics, this feels like it's almost mocking Asian cultures with its homogenization and cliches. Also, Venus specifically says that she's not a ninja, she's a shinobi. Now, in real life, they're more or less the same thing. The only difference is that, if you want to split hairs, a shinobi is specifically a male ninja. So she insists that she's a male. But no, don't think this show was woke before woke. It's just stupid. You see, in this case, shinobi is used as some sort of mystical psychic ninja or something along those lines. Honestly, they could have just made up another name for it, rather than confusing things with a name that actually exists but means something completely different. But I fear that would have made too much sense. Also, of all the colours to choose for a headband, why blue? That's Leo's colour. There are other colours you could have chosen, like yellow, for example, although I suppose that might be a bit too close to orange, or yes, even pink. I mean, this is a Saban show after all, and every female Power Ranger at this point had been yellow or pink. But then maybe pink is a little on the nose for a female character, or even a trans character, which apparently she's not. The story is split between that of Shredder, who is Urokusaki, like in the movie and the cartoons, as opposed to Urokunagi, like in the comics, along with the Foot Clan, but these only appear in the first few episodes. The real villains of this series are the Rank, a group of evil dragons who start off in a dream realm but are able to pass into the real world. And they're awful. They're not intimidating in any way whatsoever. They're just annoying. Not to mention, they're not the easiest to understand either. This time subtitles couldn't save me because they were completely out of time. But what do you think is being said here?
All we need now is dolphin scum.
Just to be clear, dolphin scum. Just in case you heard something else. They also kidnap a genius to help capture the turtles and unlock the secrets of mutation and make clones or something along those lines. Honestly, it's hard to watch at times. But the show goes way beyond anything that the movies or the cartoon ever did. Because, you see, Venus is basically a wizard, which in this universe, that's what shinobi is meant to mean. So apparently having giant, intelligent, talking, mutant turtles and rats that fight crime using expert-level martial arts wasn't strange enough. They had to go and give one of them magical powers. If anything, it feels like the show is more about Venus than any of the other turtles anyway. She's essentially the new de facto leader. Now, I'm all for having a female character of some kind, and breaking negative stereotypes by making her smart and also being able to kick bad guy butt, but they make every single character, apart from her and Splinter, seem like bumbling idiots. This is where bad writing really comes into play. Take a good script where there's a strong female lead. Often it's not written with either a woman or a man in mind, it's just written as a character, and then you can always add certain elements later to give it a more female touch, but you should always focus on the story first. With this, it's just a blatant attempt to seem like it's promoting girl power, but ends up making her annoying and condescending. And it's sad because honestly, this had all the tools to be successful. The suits are actually quite good, particularly for a TV show budget rather than a movie. They tied it into the movie series, they did a crossover with Power Rangers, they, in theory, introduced a strong female character. This should have been a slam dunk, but they messed up just about everything to do with the story. I mean, so much so that it doesn't even have an ending. And I don't mean it ends on a cliffhanger. There's just no ending. And I mean, let's also not ignore the fact that the name itself makes no sense. The show is called Ninja Turtles: The Next Mutation. Except, there is no next mutation. They don't mutate beyond what they currently are, and it's not Venus, she mutated at the same time as the others, so she can't be the next mutation, she's just the other mutation. So, what is the next mutation? It sounds more like an alternative name for an adaptation of the Super Turtles, which actually would have made more sense. And they could have just adapted that into a Western version. I mean, why not? Yeah, it's animated and that's not Saban's specialty, but it had a Power Rangers feel to it, and it was being written at the same time. Well, you see, the thing is, there was actually meant to be a next mutation. It was meant to be the fourth movie, in which there were supposed to be secondary mutations. There was also meant to be a fifth turtle introduced called Kirby, but it never saw the light of day. How we ended up with the TV show and Venus is for another video. So let's just address this. Is this a continuation of anything that's come before it? Well, the answer is maybe. The thing is, it was touted as being a continuation of the 1987 cartoon series, but it's not. At all. Even though it was released pretty soon after the cancellation of the cartoon. But there's no Krang, there's barely any Shredder, there's no Bebop, Rocksteady, or any of the villains up to Lord Dreg. Plus, they've clearly tried to make it close to the first trilogy of movies, which I guess I can understand where some of the confusion can arise, because the original cartoon actually started using footage from the movies in the opening credits too, even though they're definitely not part of the same timeline. But in the next Mutation, they're clearly in an abandoned subway station rather than just a generic sewer, so this would suggest that it's a continuation from the third movie, which isn't canon to the cartoon. But then this show puts a whole new swing on things anyway. For example, they mix things up a little with the weapons in this show. The Turtles don't stick to their signature weapons, even though Mikey had already been censored once. You know where to find out more about that. But from episode 3, we start to see Raphael with sort of a double-ended Sai lance, while Mikey has some tonfa and Leo dual-wields Ken swords, rather than katanas, even though he sometimes refers to them as katanas when they're not. The older weapons do occasionally crop up, but not that often. It's mainly Raph's Sai that make the most appearances, and that's kind of just detached versions of his double-ended Sai. However, I think they realised by the middle of the season that things just weren't working, because by episode 17, they do actually bring back Orokusaki, but the actor is just beyond terrible. And not that it matters anyway, as he completely disappears again in favour of the dragon villains, which was just a big tease that they might actually be getting back to the source material. And then after that, they also throw in a pack of vampires for reasons of I have no idea. I guess they were just throwing everything at the wall and seeing if anything stuck. As this isn't meant to be a Monster of the Week type thing, they get a few episodes, so it's almost like a mini-series within the main series. Although, as I understand it, when this first aired on TV, the return of Orokusaki was actually meant to be the penultimate episode. So I'm assuming the original plan was to have him feature more in Season 2, which makes complete sense, because if nobody ever saw the rank again, I don't think they'd lose too much sleep over it. But in fact, if you compare the list of episodes by air date to how they appear elsewhere, like on Amazon Prime for example, they don't match up at all. So if you try to stream the show, Shredder returns very briefly, but then just disappears again, and normal, that is to say awful, service resumes. Although that makes it sound like Shredder wasn't awful too, which he was. And the fact that they could just switch episodes around like that just shows that the series pretty much has no story arc. It's just a series of episodes where nothing matters. As I mentioned, the season doesn't even have an ending to it. They do sort of like a pseudo clip show and we get no wrap up to the story at all. I refuse to believe that they thought they were ever going to get a season 2 of this car crash of a show, but it does kind of look that way. That is, unless there were plans to have the first season be longer than this, but it got cancelled before they could film anything else. Honestly, I have no idea, but the least surprising thing so far is that the show got cancelled. And it's a genuine shame because even though the crossover with Power Rangers was dumb, it showed potential. But when I sat down and watched the whole show, it became very apparent why this was such a failure. There's just weird throwaway things which are clearly just meant as exposition, but end up making the audience pause and wonder whether they just saw what they just saw. For example, in episode 6, where they have Mikey preparing some food, as he often does, but rather than playing on his obsession with oddly topped pizzas, he's making a fish sandwich, or a banana split salad, or cereal with soda, or a bowl of chicken feet, or they say his favourite food is squid pot pie. I know it's a small niggling thing, but anyone who knows anything about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is that they love pizza. And Mikey is the most pizza obsessed of them all, not squid pot pie. Also, if the writers ever read the comics, they would know how the Turtles were trained as ninjas and moved in the shadows in order to avoid being seen, which makes complete sense because they're mutant turtles. They draw unnecessary attention. Now, tell me, in what way does riding a motorbike with no disguise, or cruising around New York in a brightly lit Hummer, ever come close to moving in the shadows? I mean, Raph even rides the bike in the daylight. There are things that could have been funny, like having a Yeti mobster boss called Silver, but no, that's pretty painful too. Even if his introduction was basically just a cheesier take on Die Hard with a Vengeance, complete with an attempt to steal the US gold reserve in New York, and with plenty of explosives, and then an attempt to flee with the gold via the sewers. In a nutshell, or a half shell, the show failed because it's awful. And the truth of it is, that's it. You don't really need to know any more about it. It has nothing to do with any TMNT lore, despite it technically coming from Eastman and Laird. And honestly, this should probably never be talked about again. But on that happy note, it's time to end, and I'll see you next time.